In this video, I'm going to tell you about how to achieve flow state in your miniature building and painting hobby, and how it helps you to get things done. This YouTube channel, where I've been making regular videos now for nearly 13 years, has a mission statement. Sort of. It's this: a channel about tabletop wargaming and the miniatures hobby. Mostly. Now, you'll probably notice that that's not actually a mission statement as like business people are concerned and stuff like that, but whatever. That's not really what the channel is actually about either. The channel is really about getting new people and lapsed players and hobbyists and stuff like that into, or potentially back into, tabletop wargaming and the miniatures hobby. Mostly. It doesn't really roll off the tongue. Due to this, I like to talk about hobby motivation here on the channel. I try to give people who are new to the hobby ways to convince themselves, or sometimes even to trick themselves into getting started building and painting the models that they bought, right? Like, if you have the money, buying minis is the easy part. If they're actually in stock, that is, of course. But building and painting them, that's a little bit harder. Therefore, I make videos about hobby motivation, like ways to jumpstart your hobby activity and get that brush into your hand. I've made a lot of them here on the channel because there's always a lot of ways to find motivation. But what about keeping your motivation once you get started? It can actually be very easy to find reasons to stop building and painting your miniatures once you get going. I've recently started learning more about something called flow state. Defined in Psychology Today as a cognitive state where one is completely immersed in an activity, from painting and writing to prayer and surfboarding. It includes intense focus, creative engagement, and the loss of awareness of time and self. It's interesting that painting was mentioned in there. Evidently, the idea of flow state was coined in the 1960s by a Hungarian-American psychologist whose name I cannot possibly pronounce, who was studying the creative process and found out that when an artist was in the flow state, they would persist at their task relentlessly. He also discovered that the artist would lose interest in the project after completion, which showed the increased importance of the process itself and not really the end result. The last part there I find interesting for wargaming, as the end result in miniature painting and stuff like that is frequently just a step along the way to playing a game. So, I want to focus more on ways to increase your flow state in your miniature building and painting hobby in this video, and less about ways to get motivated to start actually doing the hobby, which is generally what my videos have a tendency to focus on instead. Increased flow state will help you to not only get more miniatures built and painted, but it will also, hopefully, cause you to enjoy the process a little bit more as you get more immersed into it, increasing your engagement with the process of building and painting your miniatures. Generally, you have to prepare to flow if you want it to work, right? It can be very difficult to achieve any kind of flow state if you're distracted or stressed, let's say. This is why so many hobbyists with kids find it easier to work on their building and painting and stuff like that when they do it after the children's bedtime, for example. If you don't have kids, it can still be a struggle to come straight home from a stressful day of work and then, head immediately into your hobby. Like that stress can carry through and make your mind very diverted from your task. They also say that having a bit of a ritual can help you to prepare for a flow state. Now, this has nothing to do with wearing, sacred robes or holding cursed artifacts. sadly, but instead it can be simple things like getting a cup of tea or water or coffee or whatever you prefer, and maybe like cleaning out your paint water cup and things like that, laying out your favorite brushes, or hobby tools or whatever. All these rituals kind of cue your brain that it is now time to hobby, and then your mind is more focused on the task. It sounds a little silly, but sometimes it's a good idea to stretch a bit before you sit down to hobby, and then just a little bit of that, and then just kind of sit and focus on your breathing for a bit to help clear your head and increase your ability to get into a flow state, especially if it was a really rough trip on the way home on the train and all this kind of stuff, and you got a bunch of stress. It's a good idea to try to flush that out a little bit. I also find that just sitting and picking up my models, whether I haven't started painting on them yet at all, or whether I'm continuing to work on them, and then just holding them and looking at them, not looking for mistakes or anything like that, but just looking at them all over. It can really help to get my mind kind of quieted and prepared to flow. Another important aspect to flow preparation is to minimize your potential distractions. I usually put my phone on Do Not Disturb mode if I'm having like a hard time kind of keeping my flow state going. I usually still keep my phone near me while I hobby because I'm generally listening to a podcast or something like that, and I have to be able to, skip the annoying commercials and things. But another option is to just keep your phone completely out of arm's reach so you're not tempted to pick it up and check Discord or Instagram or, whatever your thing is. Also, it's usually best to set a goal when you're trying to get into a flow state. And I don't mean like the goal is to finish the miniatures, as that is, generally always the goal, right? What I mean is that you should take a look at the time that you have available today in this session, and then set a goal that's achievable in that amount of time, right? You have 2 free hours, you lucky rascal, then your goal might be to scrape all the rest of the mold lines off of the last 3 models in this warband, and then potentially start gluing the pieces together. Or maybe your goal is to paint the faces of these, last 4 warriors, whatever. Having an achievable goal every time you start hobbying, even if you only have like 30 minutes to spare, is always better than just stumbling through some steps with the miniatures that you're working on and seeing what you can finish. Without that goal, however small it may be, you'll be distracted by what you might be able to accomplish instead of working on what you plan to accomplish. Getting into a flow state might sound like you're just kind of getting into the zone and seeing where it takes you, but in actuality, it's easier if you have a distinct destination. When you know where you're going, then you think less about getting there and you just focus on the journey. Sometimes it's not even finishing something. Maybe it's just deciding that the hour that you have to spend hobbying before bed is going to just focus on, let's say, edge highlighting or glazing or something else that you might usually find tedious and boring. But if you know you're just going to do it for like an hour or so and you've got your podcast playing or your audiobook or music or whatever, then that hour just flies by, and that's the flow state. Another big tip is to focus on what you like, as those actions are more likely to engage your flow state. For me, building miniatures has its ups and downs. I find it pretty difficult, but not impossible, to get into a flow state when building and scraping mold lines and all that, especially with a lot of Games Workshop miniatures these days. That makes it even more difficult. But this is why I frequently these days focus on 3D printed models in many cases, because there's like little to no building and gluing, maybe a tiny bit, but not too much. Sometimes you might need to scrape off some of those little support nipples and things like that, but that's pretty much about it. But painting is something I find very enjoyable, so flow state is much more achievable for me when I've got a brush in my hand. I'm literally just focusing on the miniature, the brush, and my paints. And I suppose the water cup too. But when I'm building, then I have to switch my focus between the sprues and finding the right numbers on the sprues. And then I have to switch my focus then to the clippers and the hobby knife and the build instructions and then the glue and, all that kind of stuff and the mold lines. And then there's also the pieces you've already clipped off that you're trying to not lose on the floor and all that kind of stuff. And I find it personally more difficult to hit a flow state. One thing to note, flow state isn't always possible with every project. But there are certain tasks, not even particularly creative tasks, that will put me into a flow state very easily. Airbrushing my built miniatures is something that I can do nearly on autopilot, and the time just flies by. Priming them all black and then giving them either a standard white zenithal or maybe some other color zenithal if it's warranted. These things aren't the most creative steps, but I really, really enjoy the process and can just kind of vibe while doing it. Adding washes or weathering to a miniature is another kind of thing that I can also get lost in pretty easily. So, if you really want to try and achieve a flow state in your miniatures hobby, then it is best to prepare to flow, set a goal, and then focus on what you like. If you get better and better at doing the first two things, right, then the third thing, focus on what you like, becomes less necessary as your experience grows. Then you'll be able to find the ability to flow even when doing some things in the hobby that you don't necessarily like as much, like, say, clipping and building, for a personal example. Getting motivated to start building or painting those miniatures that you bought can be difficult. You might have self-doubt or, process confusion or a whole host of hurdles to get over. But once you get started, it's just as important to try to keep doing it, and trying to help your brain into a flow state is a great way to keep moving forward. Do you get into a flow state when you're hobbying? What tips do you use to get yourself there, into that kind of mindset? Let us all know down in the comments below. And if you liked this video, please flow over to the depressmentation of the like button, which is also down there as well. It does help the channel out and all that kind of stuff. Also, while you're down there, you could subscribe to the channel and to see, more videos like this every single Friday. It's free. Thanks for watching.